Good morning.
Larry, he started.
No problem. No, I got it started. So. Morning. So we have 2 weeks left. We're going to finish up with the prophets. Today we're going to look at Messianic references, just a couple in the book of Daniel, and then we'll get started on Zechariah, and we have to do plenty of Zechariah next week to finish it because Zechariah is a very important prophet for Messianic prophecy. But in Daniel chapter 7, we have a vision that Daniel is given of 4 different kingdoms. And this is a parallel because in these 4 kingdoms, the Medes and the Babylonians, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, were represented back in chapter 2 in a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. And you recall in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was troubled by his dream, and he called in his seers and his prophets and said, I want you to interpret my dream. And they said, okay, tell me what the dream is. And he said, no, you're supposed to be prophets. You tell me what the dream is and then interpret it. And they said, nobody's ever heard of such a thing. If you just go ahead and tell us the dream and then we'll interpret, And of course, you can always make up an interpretation. But he said, no, you tell me what the dream was in the first place and then interpret it. And he was threatening to kill them. And God appeared to Daniel in a dream and relayed the dream to Daniel. And Daniel went in and said, here's what you saw in your dream. And here's what it means. And the key meaning was that there was another kingdom after these 4 kingdoms that was not made by human hands. It's a God-made kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. And it's going to be greater than any of these kingdoms. It's going to be worldwide. It's going to triumph over that last kingdom from Rome. So this was a futuristic prophecy from Daniel that pictures the first century, that pictures the kingdom that we're part of now. But then after the 4 kingdoms vision at the beginning of Daniel 7, we have this reference to a very important phrase that we've heard in the New Testament, the Son of Man. Verses 13 and 14, Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now, the literal meaning, I saw one like a son of man, is very simple. It wasn't an angel, it wasn't the Father on a throne. It was someone who just looked like a human being. Daniel is simply explaining, this person looks like a regular man in my vision. But look what this regular man is given. He's given a kingdom. He's brought before the Father. The Father blesses him with a kingdom that lasts forever. And you'll notice something we've seen in the Messianic prophecies. The Messiah is not just for the nation of Jews. All nations, all languages, all peoples will serve him. And the word serve is a worship term. It's not just obey or something. And we'll see that later also in Zechariah. And he might look like a son of man, but Daniel's given an interpretation. And so later in the chapter, in verse 27, we see the divinity of this human appearing person in the vision. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Now, this serve and obey is not a redundant phrase. Serve doesn't just mean obey. Serve is a worship service word in the Old Testament Hebrew in numerous places. So this Son of Man looks like a man in the vision, but all peoples are invited to worship him. And so he is a divine Son of Man. Now notice that all dominions shall serve and obey. That means that there's still nations in the world and kingdoms, and there's not, one big world nation. There's still earthly nations, there's still earthly dominions, but people within each of them worship and obey this Son of Man. Now, Jesus used this phrase to refer to himself, the Son of Man. Throughout the Gospels, there's about 80 verses where Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. But it was not a name used by the early church. I think early Christians didn't really understand, because by itself it just means someone who looks like a human being. That doesn't sound all that glorious. But Jesus is identifying himself. I am the one that Daniel saw in his visions. When Daniel had messianic visions, he was seeing me in the vision. And when he takes this title for himself, Son of Man, he's making a much bigger claim, therefore, than it looks like on the surface. Because on the surface, it just means you're a human being. In the Old Testament, we only find this phrase in Daniel. But before the time of Jesus, Jews who were writing about Daniel recognized this is a messianic phrase. During the period of writing of apocryphal books, for example, it was commented upon that this was the Messiah. The Son of Man is the Messiah. But outside of Jesus using the term to refer to himself, it only appears 3 times in the rest of the New Testament. And all 3 times are in visions where someone is having a vision and they're seeing something like Daniel saw. They're seeing a human-looking person up at the right hand of God in heaven, and they refer to him as a Son of Man. The first time is when Stephen, having delivered his speech in chapter 7 of Acts to the Jewish leaders, his defense, which has them on the verge of executing him because of the message he's delivering, he gets to the end, and as they are dragging him out to stone him, he says, I see the Son of Man at the right hand of the Father, which they consider blasphemy, even though it's really just a quotation from Daniel. In Daniel's vision, there's a human person who is somehow given divine authority by the Father. And then twice in Revelation, the same thing happens when John sees the Son of Man in heaven. John uses that phrase. But otherwise, this is not a phrase that early Christians used in general of Jesus. I just don't think they fully understood it, and it doesn't really seem like much of a title maybe to them. So you go through all the epistles of Paul and Peter and James and Jude and John, and this is not what they ever called Jesus. But it's important because it really gets to the incarnation of God as man. This person is divine, this person is the Messiah, this person is at the right hand of the Father, this person is identified with the Father, and yet he just looks like a human being. And by the way, that's, part of the testimony of the authenticity of the Gospels in recording Jesus' words is that they recorded words that they didn't really understand, but they went ahead and recorded them. I don't think they fully understood why Jesus kept calling himself the Son of Man. This is not the kind of thing that a gospel author would make up and put words in Jesus' mouth, because throughout the rest of the New Testament they had never even used that phrase. It didn't really resonate with them somehow. But it's something for us to learn. Now, Zechariah is a very important source of visions. He prophesied very late. Recall that the northern tribes' captivity was 721 BC. This is 200 years later. The conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah started in 597, and it concluded with the siege of Jerusalem from 587 to 586 BC. And that's when the final carrying off to captivity, destroying the temple, and so on happened, in 586. So they've been now in Babylonia for quite some time. And Jeremiah had prophesied that after 70 years, they would start to return. And we start to see that return in Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, that's imminent here. They've been there 66 years now. And that's the time when Zechariah is having visions of the future. He's very frequently quoted in the New Testament. We said before that the Psalms are the most frequently quoted book from the Old Testament in the New Testament. Second was Isaiah. Zechariah might be third. I'd have to research it, but Zechariah is very extensively quoted, including 31 times it's referred to. When we say an allusion, maybe just a phrase or a distinctive phrase, not an entire quote. But 31 of these 71 quotations or allusions are in the visions in Revelation. But there's a couple of dozen in the Gospels also, including Jesus referring to himself by quoting Zechariah. Now, it's an apocalyptic work. It's a work of visions. Lots of visions. Messianic times and final end times are the subjects of these visions. Most prophets have some moral teaching in them, some rebuking the people and calling them to repentance and so on. Zechariah has very little of that. Zechariah is a book of visions. And they tend to be interpreted for him by an angel. So instead of us just having to figure out how to interpret, most of the time the interpretation is given right there in Zechariah. In the first 6 chapters, there are 8 visions with 8 interpretations given in Zechariah. Now, the first one we want to look at is the Messiah identified as a new high priest, one of the Messianic themes that we've seen elsewhere. Zechariah 3 shows this vision of a future high priest. And he's referred to as Joshua. Now, we've seen the future Messiah referred to as David, even though David's dead, because that's a Messianic term. When I first saw Joshua, I thought, oh, he's some sort of a new Joshua, like back in the days of Moses and Joshua. But actually, Joshua happened to be the name of the current high priest, as we see in the book of Ezra. So the one who is about to lead them in return to Jerusalem is the high priest Joshua. And so when Zechariah wants to prophesy about a new high priest, God gives him visions in which there's a man who looks like a priest named Joshua, but then things happen that can't all be the current Joshua. And we talked about this theme, right, in prophecies, that sometimes there's a very short-term part of it that fits, and then there's something that doesn't fit short-term. It has to be off in the future. And that's what we have here in Zechariah 3. So I'm just going to read, it's a brief chapter, Zechariah 3. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest, and you can find all these symbols that I list here, the key figures of the passage. You've got Joshua. He's wearing filthy clothes, which represents the sins of Israel, or they made the priest dress in filthy clothes. The angel of the Lord is the Son of God. There's a little trial going on where Satan is the accuser standing before God in the vision. The Lord of hosts, of course, is the Father. The Messiah is referred to as my servant, the branch. The branch and the servant and my servant, the branch, have all appeared in previous Messianic prophecies that we've studied. And the stone, we've seen cornerstone passages. The Messiah will be the new cornerstone. He'll be the stone the builders rejected, but later made the new cornerstone. So all of these symbols appear here in chapter 3. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, with Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. The Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. May the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Isn't this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?" Now Joshua was dressed with filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. So he, referring to the angel of the Lord, which is the Son of God, spoke to those standing before him, "Take off his filthy clothes." Then he said to him, "See, I have removed your guilt from you, and I will clothe you with splendid robes." This is a symbol of Jesus cleansing the people. Then I said, so this is very strange here by comparison to other visions. Zechariah kind of starts speaking into the vision. He starts interacting. So Zechariah says, "Then I said, let them put a clean turban on his head." Remember, the high priest wore a turban and the king wore a crown. And last week we saw a messianic prophecy in which two crowns, the turban with tiara and the king's crown, were put on one Messiah figure's head, meaning the Messiah is going to be both a new king and a new priest. We'll see that again too. So a clean turban was placed on his head, and they clothed him in garments while the angel of the Lord was standing nearby. Then the angel of the Lord charged Joshua, "This is what the Lord of hosts says, if you walk in my ways and keep my instructions, you will both rule my house and take care of my courts. I will also grant you access among these who are standing here. Listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your colleagues sitting before you. Indeed, these men are a sign that I am about to bring my servant, the branch. Notice the stone I have set before Joshua. On that one stone are 7 eyes." And there's reference to this in the book of Revelation. "I will engrave an inscription on it, the declaration of the Lord of hosts. And I will take away the guilt of this land in a single day. On that day, each of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and fig tree. This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts." Now, cleansing the people in a single day, all the people, is not something that a high priest can do except for the Messiah. And this is a reference that was applied to Jesus to the crucifixion. In the crucifixion, Jesus can cleanse everyone in a single day. Now we have this priest and king combination in chapter 6 of Zechariah. In verses 9 through 15, we read about an offering that's being brought from the Babylonians who are still in exile are bringing an offering, or the Jews who are still in Babylonian exile are bringing an offer of silver and gold to Jerusalem. And In the vision, Zechariah is told he's supposed to take this silver and gold and make 2 crowns and put them on the head of Joshua, the high priest. Now, just as in chapter 3, Joshua isn't just the current high priest. He's a messianic symbol also. Verse 13 says he's going to sit on a throne. Now, a priest does not sit on a throne. A king sits on a throne. The high priest is never recorded as sitting on a throne. So, this is obviously a reference to one man is going to be both priest and king. It's not going to be the literal Joshua, the high priest, in the late 6th century BC, because in the Mosaic law, the kings were all descended from the tribe of Judah, going back to Genesis 49, the promise that the kings would come from Judah. And the promise to David that they would be descended from him within the tribe of Judah. But of course, where did priests come from? Not the tribe of Judah, right? The tribe of Levi. So it is not possible in the old covenant for one man to be the high priest and the king. Only if there's a new covenant is that possible. And that's what's going to happen. We're going to have a new covenant where one man is both the new king and the new priest. Now, in some translations, they actually have trouble making sense of it. I even saw one commentator in the Hebrew say, it doesn't make sense to put 2 crowns on one head. But that kind of misses the whole point. Yeah, normally that'd be true, but that misses the point. In the verse 11, where it says, take silver and gold, make crowns, and place them on the head of Joshua, the high priest. Some translations, even though the Hebrew is plural for crowns, translates it singular, crown. And that kind of misses the whole point here. There is one man who's going to wear the crown or tiara of the high priest, and he's also going to wear the crown of the king. So this is intentional. This is the point. Might be mysterious to the Jews of the time. But yes, it is crowns, plural, in the Hebrew in verse 11. Even the JPS, the Jerusalem Publication Society, which produces the Hebrew translation into English of just the Old Testament, of course, because they're Jewish, has crowns, plural. And yet, at least half of our translations today have the singular, which is very odd. It's not what the Hebrew has. But this is intentional. This is important here. We have a figure who's going to be a new high priest. He's also going to be a new king. That cannot be the Joshua of 500 BC who's high priest. He cannot be the king. So once again, some of this language could apply just to Joshua, the high priest in 500 and something BC. But some of the language cannot possibly apply to him. It has to be, therefore, in the future. And it's clear that it's a Messiah figure when he said, here's a man whose name is Branch. He will branch out from his place and build the Lord's temple. So this is a Messiah reference. And nobody, Jewish or otherwise, thinks that Joshua, the high priest at the time, was the Messiah. This is a messianic reference, therefore it's in the future. So, though that vision was actually the 8th of the visions in the first 6 chapters of Zechariah. And we'll look at some key Zechariah visions next week, including visions that Jesus explicitly applies to himself by quoting, that get us into some New Testament language that's pretty interesting. Thank you.